On the morning of June 22, 1941, General Dmitry Pavlov was asleep in his headquarters in Minsk when the telephone began ringing with reports that made no sense. His Western Special Military District, the largest and most powerful Soviet military formation on the entire Western frontier, with over 625,000 men, more than 2,000 tanks, and nearly 1,900 aircraft, was disintegrating in ways that his training told him were operationally impossible. The reports said German armor had crossed the Bug River at multiple points simultaneously. The reports said Soviet border units had been overrun before they could transmit coherent messages. The reports said German aircraft had destroyed most of the district's air assets on the ground, lined up in neat rows at forward airfields in the pre-dawn darkness. Pavlov kept asking the same question to every officer who called. How far have they penetrated? The answer kept changing. The answer kept getting worse. By midday, the answer had ceased to mean anything, because the concept of a coherent front, the concept his entire training and doctrine assumed as the fundamental condition of modern warfare, had stopped existing. For weeks later, Pavlov was arrested by NKVD officers, charged with cowardice and dereliction of duty, tried in a military tribunal that lasted less than a day, and shot. By that point, his Western Military District had lost approximately 420,000 men killed or captured, virtually all of its armor, and nearly all of its aircraft. The Minsk pocket had closed around nearly 300,000 Soviet soldiers who would spend years in German captivity, most of them dying there. The Germans had advanced over 300 kilometers in 4 weeks. They were not slowing down. 800 kilometers to the south, in a map room in Berlin, Colonel General Franz Halder was updating his war diary with the composed precision of a man recording data that confirmed his expectations. Halder had been the Wehrmacht's chief of the General Staff since 1938. He had overseen the planning of Fall Barbarossa with the systematic thoroughness that had made his reputation as possibly the finest operational planner in the German military. And he was writing on July 3, 1941, 11 days into the invasion, a sentence that history would quote for decades. I am not overstating the case when I say that the campaign against Russia was won in 14 days. The distance between these two men, Pavlov in handcuffs, Halder in his map room, contains one of the most extraordinary paradoxes of the entire Second World War. The Soviet military of 1941 was not ignorant of German doctrine. It was not unprepared in any simple sense. Soviet generals had studied the German campaigns in Poland and France with an intensity bordering on obsession. They had manual structure analyses. They had officers who had observed German exercises as military attaches. They had, in some respects, a theoretical understanding of Blitzkrieg that was more sophisticated than the understanding possessed by the French generals who had been destroyed by it 14 months earlier. And yet, in the first 3 weeks of Barbarossa, the Soviet Union lost approximately 800,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. It lost more tanks than the entire German armored force that had crossed the border. It lost more aircraft than the Luftwaffe had deployed for the invasion. It experienced the largest military collapse of a major power in the history of modern warfare against a doctrine it had spent 2 years studying. This is the story of how a military can know everything about an enemy's method and still be destroyed by it, and why the gap between understanding a doctrine and being able to counter it is sometimes the most lethal gap in all of warfare. The Soviet study of German operational methods between 1939 and 1941 was neither superficial nor uninformed. It was, by the standards of the time, among the most thorough foreign military analyses being conducted anywhere in the world. When Germany destroyed Poland in September 1939, Soviet military observers accompanied the advancing German forces under the terms of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, watching the operations at close range with professional attention that their reports preserved in considerable detail. What they saw confirmed theories that a school of Soviet military thinking, developed primarily by Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky in the 1930s, had already articulated that modern warfare would be decided not by linear advances along defined fronts, but by deep penetrations using mechanized forces that bypassed and encircled enemy formations before they could react. Tukhachevsky's theory of deep battle was, in its essentials, a Soviet formulation of the same operational concept that Guderian and Manstein had developed independently, and that the Wehrmacht was now executing in Poland with devastating effectiveness. The Soviet military had been thinking about mobile mechanized warfare at least as long as the Germans had. In some respects, it had been thinking about it more ambitiously. Tukhachevsky's vision of simultaneous, deep operations across an entire strategic front was, on paper, more comprehensive than anything the Wehrmacht's doctrine explicitly addressed. The problem was that Tukhachevsky was dead. Stalin had executed him in June 1937 during the purge of the Red Army's senior officer corps, on charges of treason that were transparently fabricated. With Tukhachevsky died not just a man but an entire intellectual tradition within the Soviet military, a tradition of independent operational thinking, of doctrinal innovation, of willingness to develop theories that challenged orthodoxy and argue for their adoption against institutional resistance. The officers who survived the purge had survived partly by being the kind of officers who did not challenge orthodoxy. The Red Army of 1941 was staffed, in its senior ranks, by men selected partly for their willingness to tell superiors what those superiors wanted to hear. When the lessons of Poland and France were analyzed by Soviet military writers and staff officers in 1940 and 1941, the analyzers were therefore filtered through an institutional culture that had been systematically purged of its most intellectually independent members. The analyzers were detailed. They were sometimes perceptive. But they were produced by men working within a system that punished the kind of conclusions most threatening to institutional comfort. The conclusion, for instance, that the fundamental organizational structure of the Red Army might need to be rebuilt from the ground up if it was to counter what the Germans had done in France. General Georgy Zhukov, who would eventually become the Finnish Soviet military commander of the war, was in 1941 the chief of the General Staff, the position that should have been most directly responsible for translating the lessons of Germany's Western campaigns into Soviet operational readiness. Zhukov was not a man lacking in either intelligence or courage. He had demonstrated both at Kalkangal in 1939, where he had conducted the kind of mobile combined arms operation against Japan that the deep battle theorists had envisioned. He understood better than most of his contemporaries what the Germans were doing and why it worked. But Zhukov was also operating within constraints that his position in the Soviet command system imposed on any general, however capable. He could analyze German doctrine. He could present proposals for Soviet reorganization. He could, within limits, argue for changes that he believed necessary. What he could not do was implement changes that Stalin opposed, override the institutional inertia of a military bureaucracy that had just spent 3 years eliminating its most innovative officers, or create in 18 months the kind of combined arms proficiency that the Germans had developed over 20 years of uninterrupted doctrinal evolution. The specific mechanics of how the German Blitzkrieg destroyed the Soviet Western military district in the first weeks of Barbarossa reveal, with unusual clarity, the difference between understanding a doctrine theoretically and being able to counter it operationally. The first and most fundamental element was communications. The German method depended on communications at every level between tank commanders and their infantry, between forward reconnaissance elements and the Corps' headquarters deciding where to commit the armored follow-on forces. between Luftwaffe, ground attack aircraft, and the panzer spearheads they were supporting. These communications were not simply a technical capability. They were the nervous system of a doctrine that required constant real-time information processing to function. When German communications worked, German forces could respond to battlefield developments faster than opponents could adapt. When they failed, as they sometimes did, the German advance stalled or created exploitable vulnerabilities. The Soviet communications system in June 1941 was, by comparison, operating at a level of technological and organizational development that made real-time tactical coordination of the kind German doctrine required almost physically impossible. Soviet radio equipment was scarce, maintenance was poor, and operator training was inadequate for the tempo of operations that the German advance immediately imposed. More critically, the Soviet command culture had developed. Under the pressure of the purges, a profound institutional aversion to initiative. Commanders who acted without authorization risked being accused of the same independent decision-making that had gotten their predecessors arrested and shot. The result was a culture where critical information moved up the chain slowly, waiting for authorization at each level, while decisions moved down the chain even more slowly, waiting for confirmation from above. General Paul von Kleist, command during the Frosterborough, described the phenomenon in his post-war interrogation with the detached analytical interest of a professional soldier studying an enemy's behavior. We expected the Soviets to respond to our penetrations by counterattacking the flanks of our corridors, he said. This was the correct tactical response. It was what we would have done. What any trained staff officer would identify as the correct response within hours of the penetration. The Soviets knew this was the correct response. We captured documents that showed they knew. But the response required initiative at the divisional and corps level. Decisions made by commanders who could see the local situation and act without waiting for orders from above. Their system could not produce this. By the time authorization came down for the flanking attack, we were already 50 kilometers past the point where the attack would have been effective. Wrong. Kleist's observation, they knew but their system could not produce the response, is the central explanation for the catastrophe of the first weeks of Barbarossa. Soviet generals had read the manuals. They had written their own manuals, some of which were theoretically sophisticated. But reading a manual and building an institution capable of executing what the manual describes are separated by a gap that cannot be closed by intellectual understanding alone. The execution required an organizational culture, a nervous system of communications, initiative, and adaptive command that the Red Army of 1941 had been systematically dismantled in its capacity to develop. The border battles of June and early July 1941 were a cascade of disasters that followed a pattern so consistent across the entire front that it reveals the systemic nature of the Soviet failure rather than a series of independent accidents. In the north, Army Group North under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb crossed the border at 3:15 in the morning on June 22nd and drove toward Leningrad with a speed that Soviet commanders found literally impossible to process. The 4th Panzer Group under General Erich Hoepner covered 300 kilometers in the first week, a rate of advance that exceeded the most optimistic projections of the German planning staff. Soviet units that found themselves in the path of the German advance attempted to establish defensive lines, received contradictory orders from multiple superior headquarters, moved to comply with one set of orders, and found themselves in the flank of a German advance they had not been informed about, and were destroyed in detail before coherent resistance was possible. The pattern in the center was worse. The 2 principal panzer groups of Army Group Center, Guderian's 2nd Panzer, group advancing from the south, and Hoth's 3rd Panzer, group advancing from the north, were executing a double envelopment of Soviet forces around Minsk that the German planning staff had designed, and that, from the first day, unfolded almost exactly as designed. The Soviet forces being encircled were not passive. Soviet soldiers fought with a ferocity that surprised German commanders who had expected, based on the performance of Soviet forces in Finland, easier opposition. But fighting ferociously within an encirclement is not the same as preventing the encirclement. And the Soviet command system's inability to order and coordinate a breakout, while it was still possible, condemned those men to capture or death. General Heinz Guderian of Minsk-Klerkenmoos from his post wrote in his diary about the tactical surprise that the Red Army's response had created, not because it was effective, but because it was, in a specific way, unexpected. We anticipated disorder in their response, he wrote. We found something that was both less and more than we anticipated. Their infantry fought with a stubbornness that we had not predicted from the Finnish campaign's evidence. But their command system was not merely disordered, it was paralyzed. The men were willing, the system was frozen. This was a different problem than pure fighting quality, and it was, for our purposes, a more useful problem for them to have. The encirclement of Minsk trapped approximately 290,000 Soviet soldiers. When the pocket was reduced in the days following, German forces processed prisoners in numbers that overwhelmed their own logistics. There were more prisoners than there were German soldiers available to guard them. More prisoners than the existing prisoner facilities could accommodate. More prisoners than the German supply system could feed. The logistical crisis of the German success in the first weeks of Barbarossa was, in a grim irony, partly created by the scale of their own victory. The Soviet leadership's response to the initial disasters of Barbarossa reveals as much about the systemic nature of the failure as the disasters themselves. Stalin's immediate reaction was not to analyze what had gone wrong operationally and develop corrections. His immediate reaction was to find individuals to blame and punish them with the same brutal efficiency that the purge had established as the Soviet system's preferred method for managing failure. Pavlov was the most prominent victim of this impulse, but he was not alone. General Vladimir Klimovsky Pavlovsky von Schott, General Alexander commanding the 4th Shot, several other senior officers in the Western Military District faced the same fate within days. The executions were, from Stalin's perspective, politically coherent. The purge had established the principle that military failure was evidence of disloyalty rather than evidence of systemic problems, requiring systemic solutions. If the Western Military District had collapsed, the explanation must be that Pavlov and his subordinates had betrayed the Soviet Union. Not that the doctrine they were implementing was inadequate, the communication systems were insufficient, or the command culture the purges had created was incapable of the adaptive response that German Blitzkrieg required. This interpretation had the virtue, from Stalin's perspective, of requiring no changes that would implicate Stalin's own role in creating the conditions for the disaster. But it also meant that the systemic problems driving the collapse, the communications failures, the command culture paralysis, the doctrinal inadequacies, remained unaddressed while the Germans continued to advance. General Alas Vasilevsky, who served on the Soviet General Staff throughout the war and was one of the few officers who managed both to survive and to retain Stalin's trust while providing genuine military analysis, described the period in his memoirs with careful understatement that still communicated the essential truth. The first weeks of the war required us to learn lessons that we could not afford to learn slowly, he wrote. The cost of each lesson was measured in tens of thousands of men. We paid those costs because we had no choice. The alternative was defeat. The alternative was defeat. Vasilevsky's formulation was not rhetoric. By late July 1941, the German advance had consumed more Soviet military strength than any previous campaign in history had consumed of any army incomparable time. The numbers were staggering in their scale. Approximately 600,000 soldiers killed or captured in the first month, over 6,000 tanks destroyed or captured, nearly 3,000 aircraft lost. These were not figures that a military with finite resources could absorb indefinitely. The Soviet Union's survival in the summer and fall of 1941 required not just replacing what had been lost, but changing the fundamental nature of the institution doing the fighting. The transformation that followed the disasters of the summer of 1941 was one of the most remarkable institutional adaptations in military history, and it is precisely because that transformation happened that the gap between the Soviet military's theoretical knowledge of German doctrine and its practical ability to counter it is so instructive. The adaptation did not happen through the kind of rapid, coherent reform program that post-war narratives sometimes imply. It happened through a brutal iterative process of failure, partial correction, further failure, and incremental improvement that consumed millions of lives over 3 years of the most destructive warfare the European continent had ever experienced. But it happened, and the mechanism through which it happened reveals what the Soviet military of June 1941 had been missing. The most critical change was in the command culture. Stalin did not suddenly become willing to tolerate independent military judgment. His fundamental distrust of independent judgment in subordinates never fully disappeared. But the scale of the disaster had created a practical argument for tactical flexibility that even Stalin could not ignore. Commanders who showed the ability to adapt in contact with the enemy began to be promoted rather than suspected. Commanders who froze waiting for orders that could not reach them in time began to be replaced rather than simply punished. The culture did not become the German culture of initiative and mission-oriented command, but it moved, incrementally and painfully, away from the paralysis that had destroyed Pavlov's army in for weeks. General Vasyur, who would command the Soviet 62nd Army during the Battle of Stalingrad, and whose defense of that city would become the turning point of the entire war, described the change from his perspective at the sharp end of the fighting. In 1941, he said, the question every commander was asking was, "What are my orders?" In 1942 and 1943, the question was beginning to be, "What do I need to do?" These sound like the same question. They are not. The first question is about permission. The second question is about purpose. An army of the first kind can be paralyzed by a communications failure. An army of the second kind continues to function. Zhukov's distinction, permission. Veyssou's purpose describes more precisely than any doctrinal analysis the specific gap that German Blitzkrieg had exploited in the summer of 1941. The Soviet generals had read every German manual. They had understood, theoretically, what German doctrine required of the defending force to counter it effectively. But their army had been an army of permission, not of purpose. And an army of permission, when its communications are disrupted and its headquarters are destroyed and its orders cannot reach the men who need them, has nothing to fall back on. The Germans had built their doctrine on the assumption that war would present conditions that no manual could fully anticipate, and that the response to those conditions required individual judgment exercised at the lowest level at which the situation could be understood. They called this Auftragstactik, mission tactics, and it was so deeply embedded in German military culture that it functioned even when the formal command structure was disrupted or destroyed. The Soviet generals who had read the German manuals had understood intellectually what Auftragstactik described. What they could not create. In 18 months of studying the manuals, while their most intellectually independent officers were being shot, was an institution that practiced it. The enduring lesson of the first weeks of Barbarossa is not about German excellence or Soviet incompetence in any simple sense. Both are too reductive to capture what actually happened. The Red Army of June 1941 contained men of considerable ability and, genuine courage, as the ferocity of Soviet resistance at the unit level repeatedly demonstrated, even during the worst of the summer disasters. It contained officers who understood, at least theoretically, what their enemy was doing. It contained a theoretical doctrine deep battle that was, in its intellectual foundations, not fundamentally inferior to the doctrine being used against it. What it did not contain was an institutional culture capable of translating that doctrine into the kind of adaptive, decentralized, initiative-driven execution that German Blitzkrieg required its opponents to match in order to survive. The purges had not merely killed individuals. They had killed a way of thinking. And the way of thinking they killed was precisely the way of thinking that survival, in the face of German operational method, required. General Friedrich von Paulus Hugo de Wehr, 6th Army at Stalingrad, the battle that marked the definitive turning of the war in the East, was interrogated by Soviet officers after his capture in February. 1943, asked what had changed in the Soviet military between 1941 and 1943. Paulus gave an answer that his captors found simultaneously flattering and accurate. In 1941, he said, "We were fighting against a military that knew what to do but could not do it." By 1943, we were fighting against a military that knew what to do and was learning to do it. The difference cost us everything. They knew what to do but could not do it. Paulus had identified, from the enemy's perspective, exactly the paradox that the Soviet military of June 1941 represented. The manuals had been read. The lessons had been noted. The theory was not the problem. The problem was the 800,000 men who died in 3 weeks, while the theory waited for an institution capable of executing it. If this story has seemed important to you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories like this, moments when the gap between knowing and doing decided the fate of armies and nations. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the entire world, and every perspective enriches the conversation. Thank you for watching and for keeping these stories alive.